Yes, good morning, everybody, and welcome to chapters 5 and 6 of BA 360, International Business and Global Trade. So as we take a look at today, we're going to we're moving into the cultural aspects of things. So when we're kind of looking at culture, in these couple of chapters here and how things are constructed. So when we talk about culture, as many of you may or may not have had from organizational behavior or any of your social psychology, sociology classes, it's a learned behavior, a way of life for a group of people in an independent community. So of the Northeast, for instance, or of Texas, or of the Southwest. So the aspect of an independent community is pretty broad, and it can actually go all the way down to such a groups such as Native Americans on the Cherokee Reservation up in North Carolina, because then their culture and their way of life for that group is going to be drastically different, even though it's not a large area or a large group of people. Characteristics of culture. Culture is not necessarily inherited, it is a learned aspect. And there's definitely some research that can back that up. But it's almost impossible to change an entire country's culture. So, for instance, to change the culture of Germany or Austria or Switzerland, which has three different cultures, is not going to happen. Just like we talked about in organizational behavior, it's difficult to change an organization's culture as it is, but it is possible. But when you're talking about an entire country's culture, you're not going to be able to change that very well. So you've got to learn as a global firm, global organizations need to figure out the importance of the different aspects of culture in the market. And those are things that you can ascertain whether or not it's a good market for you to be in. If your organization, for instance, is highly women, perhaps the Mideast is not a place you would like to be because it's just not going that cultural aspect of the Mideast and is not, and those areas all the way over to Pakistan, basically, those countries there are all, and of the Arabian Peninsula, it's not very advantageous for women. It's very difficult for women to operate there. It's not that it can't be done, but it may not be in your cultural awareness to be able to move in that direction. So that kind of combines those last 2 points right there, which is you really need to look at yourself and make sure you're a good fit for where you're going. The first element of culture is going to be the language that we speak. I joke often with people that the Southern dialect has its own connotations to it from the deep South. I've lived in the South now for 30 years, so I can kind of say that. But people from the South do actually have an interesting verbal aspect to the language, no different than a New York or a Boston accent that you would find from those individuals who live in those areas. So verbal communication is obviously the spoken word, and how the verbal aspect of things are communicated. Now, some elements that you can't change that, but does that mean you can't communicate if you don't understand the language? No. I've traveled the world quite extensively in China. We used a lot of Google Translate, but we also kind of understood commonalities. Having a conversation is a little more difficult, but getting communication to happen is not. So nonverbal communications, things like the tone of your voice, if you're raised, if you're animated, if you're by the use of your hands, eye contact with individuals is extremely important. how you sit, how you stand, how you walk are all nonverbal cues of communication. Things like, the way your face is, people read into that. Having worked with many deaf individuals, they work very much off of facial features and how your body language is. And then backward translation. So this is the aspect of the written word where you can write it in English, translate it, and then translate it back to make sure that it actually is what you want it to say. This is what I recommend for a lot of students who are on, especially students where English is not their first language. And they're using a translator to help them write. I say you need to translate that twice. Once from English or from a foreign language to English and then a foreign language back to make sure that it is actually translating well. English is a complex language, probably more complex than any other except maybe the Germanic languages. We have a lot of words and a lot of tenses and things that don't translate well, especially into the Romance languages of Spanish, Italian, French, or into the symbol-based languages of Arabic or Russia, Chinese. Those verbs and those things, the way we tense things does not translate very well into those languages. So we have to be really careful when we're actually, and how we speak really works in that aspect. But backward translation is one of those aspects that can help you with that. So when we look at this, okay, these are three other elements of culture that you can't change. Religion. Religion could actually affect your business operation. It affects business operations here in the US. For instance, if you have Muslims, they have a different time and timing of their holidays. They have a different timing of their Sabbath, their holy day. If you have Jewish people, Jews have also, they operate on the Sabbath being on Saturday or the holy day being Saturday. And I've had individuals who can't work Saturdays. The good thing is they can work Sundays when most Christian religions would prefer to be off. There's also manufacturing and marketing products. Certain products are not going to go well in highly religious societies. So you're going to have to understand, as well as the fact you can't market in the same way that you would in those highly religious societies. So, I mean, you really have to consider what your product is and what that impact of religion is. Even in the US, we consider that. There are some things that wouldn't be manufactured quite or offered for sale quite as overtly as they would be, say, in the Northeast or in California. I mean, you can really see that a little bit. Values. This is one of those where you can see that values of a society or even a subsection of society or culture come into play. Basic beliefs are pervasive in a society. So in other words, if you go to most Muslim countries, including ones that we do business with often, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, those societies are still believe that the values of the society is that women are not quite on the same level as men. Some of that's that also some of that reverts back to religion, but some of that's just the way the society has grown and accepted that over the years. Now, can they change that? Yeah, they are changing that very slowly. Those basic beliefs or philosophies that happen in a society. The way you market in a society such as China is way different than, say, a society such as Thailand. Both Asian cultures, but the values and beliefs of those societies are completely different as far as what they're accepting and what would be available to them. And then their attitudes, feelings, or opinions. So, culture, for instance, we can see this aspect playing out in our country right now. Depending on how you look at it, and just different sides of the abortion issue at the moment is definitely some of that's a feeling. One one side feels that, life begins the minute it happens, the minute the two parts meet. And the other part believes that, life really happens somewhere down the road at some other point. Those are feelings. Those are not anything that's really, and they're an opinion. They're not necessarily a proven fact, because at this point, nobody can really prove that fact. So that's an example of an attitude in a culture. And it depends on how you view that. Depends on where you're at. The elements of culture, okay, again, is manners, customs, material elements, aesthetics, okay? So manners and customs, it's the way society does things. And again, we can take a look at, most of the first world societies have a commonality of the way they do things. However, some societies, though, it's customary to give gifts. It's not customary for us to give gifts. As a matter of fact, it might cause us some problems. So those are things that you have to kind of look and balance with a society, the way a society operates. To be, in one world it's a gift, and in another world it's a bribe. So those are things where, it's very, for instance, if you're in Japan, it's customary to, when you're doing business with them, to print your business card on both sides, one in Japanese, one in English. And there's a whole mannerism in the way you would present that card to them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit here when we get into the elements of different kinds of societies. The material culture, so sometimes there's, it is a direct result of technology. Cell phones are available almost every country in the world, actually in every country in the world. Some of them are not as well thought of at this point. So how you get to your market may be different. And basically, the technology aspect of this is a way people are acquiring wealth, and they're acquiring materials. We are a materialistic global society. Even those that are communism in nature, as we get into in a little bit, we talk a little bit in the next few slides down about government. Even they have become more materialistic into what they would like to see. And then we get into the aesthetics. Color, form, music are major components of what we consider to be aesthetics. So what's considered to be tasteful is going to be different in each society. What's acceptable in Thailand, for instance, as far as taste goes, probably won't fly in China, or in the Mideastern countries. What's acceptable in the U.S. is definitely not transferable across the world. As we talk about in global experience, when you go into certain societies, for instance, when we were talking about the South American cultures, Central and South American cultures are not open to the LGBTQ community. They're not openly accepting of that as a society. So you have to be a little bit more cautious in your doing what your company standpoint would be on that, because you may not be perceived very well in that society for those views. And you can go down the avenue of social reform and the rest of that, but the ultimate part of this in business is you still have to do business there. And if your views and aesthetics of your company are something that you're not willing to adapt to, then you really need to kind of need to rethink whether that's a good country for you to move into. The elements of culture as far as education goes, okay? And we can kind of see this in the way these countries have developed. So, how important is education? And we can see, and there's 3 examples here which are very applicable, and we can easily see how it applies to the US. South Korea and Japan stress sciences and engineering, and not a surprise, right? What are Japan's major exports? Cars, technology. Okay, South Korea and South Korea and Japan both. where they export for the most part things like cars, electronics, TVs, cell phones. Okay, most of the major manufacturers are, cell phones are based in Japan, with the exception of maybe Apple, but then they're all made over there. So they need to have that workforce, and they have that ready workforce available to handle that technology aspect. Russia, you can see right now, by the amount of negative press they've been getting, as far as computer programming goes. They're all at this point. Russia is really large into computer programming, and a lot of it is playing into hacking and disrupting the world. That's a different political issue, but you can see why they're really good at that aspect of it. A lot of Russian programmers are looking to hack at other aspects, so that's why they have that technology aspect of it, which is very good at figuring out how to get into other systems. It's also a friendly government who supports that activity, so that's a political part of that. But they have the people and the technology base there to do that. India is looking at software development, okay, and engineering as well. So they're the up and coming technology aspect of this, where they're looking at processes and engineering from a process standpoint and developing software to go with it. So when you take a look at those aspects, the country's putting that infrastructure in place to helpfully move them forward, and it's becoming part of their culture. Now, a lot of countries do have a tiered system of higher education. Typically, it's not like the U.S. where we have a bachelor's, an associate's, bachelor's, master's, doctorate program. Typically, they will have what they call a lower degree, which is the bachelor's degree. They'll have a higher degree, which is our equivalent to our master's. And then a few of them have doctoral programs, but not very many. Most of those are US type of specialization. So when we look at social institutions, so these are aspects of how groups are important, how they play into it, and certain groups are there. Is there a social structure to it? Is there, for instance, in India, there still is kind of almost a caste system, even though it's not exactly that anymore, but there is a social stratification in India. There's also a very large social stratification in China, where members of the party are really at the top of that ladder in China, and some of the middle management, it gets a little bit of that, but the average worker does not. The average worker is pretty poor, actually. So there is a very interesting aspect of social stratification in a lot of countries. So we'll take a look at a couple of these here. Two individuals that we have here are Hofstede and Trompenauer. I always have a problem with that name. But basically, these are two guys that these are two individuals who looked at society and how culture plays into it. Now, Hofstede, we've looked at from culture, from an organizational behavior standpoint, for anybody who's actually had that course, we've looked at Hofstede. So Hofstede basically has this aspect of individualism versus collectivism. So is a culture individually based? In other words, is the worth of the individual much more important than the need of the whole? So collectivism groups are, as we get into it, are groups like Russia, China, North Korea, Vietnam, where collectivism, the wealth of the society or the importance of the overall is more important than individualism. Whereas in a lot of our first world countries, Europe and the US, individualism is prized over that. So power distance is that kind of equal, where you're looking at equality versus authority. So in societies where, where you get how the power distance works, so how important are things like elders How important is the power structure from the individuals that are in the society? um, Oligarchies and dictators and those types of things are all highly, the distance between them and the people is very far. So you really want to kind of, and it's not, everybody's not really equal in those societies. There is a definite power structure at the top, and it's not as easy to get to from the bottom. Societies that are considered masculine or feminine. He broke those down into those types of societies. So masculine are looking like, how assertive are they as a society? Are they looking at being, or are they caring for each other, or more caring in nature? We have a tendency to be sometimes view those as masculine and feminine characteristics. So typically, when I think of a feminine culture, I always think about the Norwegian states, the areas of Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, because their societies are all very about inclusive. They're also very much collectivism in nature. So they're really about the collective and everybody being happy and those types of things, and really wanting the whole society to be warm and inviting. Whereas typically a masculine culture is going to be somebody, typically the Latin cultures, for instance, comes to mind with a masculine culture. The same with your Asian cultures, Japan, China, Korea, where everything is harsh, and even Germany is considered to be, I would consider to be a really kind of a masculine society. And that's not really, that means that men are in power. It means that how society actually acts. It's very abrupt. It's very deliberate. It's not really necessarily caring about the impact of one individual section of the culture when they make their actions. Whereas typically feminine cultures they'll think the whole thing through and want to make sure that everybody's going to be embraced by that culture, by that decision. The aspect of uncertainty avoidance. Okay, Hofstede broke this down into, okay, how much is a culture wanting to take risks? So when you take a look at risk aversion, for instance, it kind of goes hand in hand with the cultures we talked about, more feminine cultures. They're very risk averse. So they're not taking a lot of huge gambles. Whereas masculine cultures have a tendency to, according to his research, take on that uncertainty and move forward, not really caring. So it's about how much of the culture will avoid uncertainty. And then the last one is time orientation. So when you look at how much time plays into a fact. So is it a short run or a long-term business? So if you're doing business in China, for instance, or the Chinese, they're a more patient people, if I want to quote it like that. So time to them is they're in the long game, and we can see that kind of politically now in their movements and those types of things. So they're in it for the long game. Whereas a lot of Western cultures are all about this moving on quickly, making things happen right away. So then we got this aspect of Trompennoir, okay, who's another researcher who did some aspects of, and he broke down societies a little bit differently, or cultures differently. The first one is universalism versus particularism. So universalism is that aspect of being the importance of rules, and we look at this as rules versus non-rules, or relationships. So when you take a look at that, if you're this is where you kind of look at this is universalism is when you look at this, and it almost kind of bridges into the ethics aspect of it too. the book uses you're in a car accident in a different country, and you're not wanting to call the police, but you may want to call the police because that aspect of being particular is more about the rules of things, which is the universalism, or the particulars. It would be, that aspect of the fact that that person's your friend. The rule is he or she broke the law or broke rules. So that's universalism. So do you side with universalism, or do you side with being the particular aspect of it, or the relationship aspect of it? These aspects here are kind of, I look at when you look at this is kind of, we look at this in ethics. Would you turn that person in, or would you just let it go because they're your friend? So we kind of look at both of these aspects in ethics as well. Neutral versus emotional. Okay. I think when you talk about neutral societies, that don't get, again, we go back to the Swiss, or I'll go back to the Swiss, or to the cultures of the Norwegian states, or those countries, Denmark, Sweden, kind of neutral, not very emotional as far as the way the culture handles world politics, or they're not excitable. But emotion culture is your Latin culture, is your Asian cultures can be also pretty neutral, but emotional cultures are definitely your Latin cultures, your Arab cultures, some African cultures are very emotional. So they're reacting to, as a society, very emotionally to this. You can see kind of how their governments react to it. Even Israel is considered really an emotional state because of how they react to things very specifically, especially in some cases. Then you have the specific versus the diverse, which is specific instances, compartmentalism of roles, or how diffuse are they? Are things spread out in the society? And then achievement versus ascription. So achievement in this aspect is how rewards are handed out. Are they based on performance, kind of like the U.S.? The better you perform, well, traditionally how it is in the U.S. is the better you perform, the better, the more achievement you can get. Whereas the ascription typically, which is kind of where we're bridging on in this culture at this point, where how much is society going to give you? And that's where you kind of have to draw that difference between the cultures. So these guys kind of really broke down culture a little bit differently than other people had in the past. And a couple of things that were interesting here, and are really kind of key when you're looking at, and these are the factors between those two, those two different kinds of, they kind of merged both Hofstede and Tromponor, and they kind of rated this. So when you're looking at Latin Europe, these are how the Latin cultures kind of weigh in here. On the higher the number, the more likely that issue is to be, and that might be an issue there. So for instance, we'll go down here to gender equalization. So we're going to come down to the Arab cultures here. So the higher the number, you want these numbers to be high. So this is actually below 3. So on gender equalitarianism, hard to pronounce, but basically gender equality. And you can see by these countries over here, the Arabic countries, Egypt, Morocco, Turkey, Kuwait, Qatar, or Qatar, very low on gender equality. So if you, like I said, if you have a highly women-centered company, you're probably not going to want to be in that country. But if you come down, if you go up here, you go into Eastern Europe, that's a whole different story. That's almost 4. So that's a score of almost 4. So this was some research where they kind of, the Globe Project kind of ranked these on these different factors, which are based right off of the other 2 researchers. So what they did is they kind of took a look down through here, uncertainty avoidance. Okay, as you go across there, power distance is really low, is very high. So that's a low power distance. It kind of works in reverse. So you want the higher the number. So power distance here means they're pretty accessible as cultures. And you take a look at these, you can see that they are pretty accessible cultures. Israel is considered a very accessible culture between their government and their people. Spain, Portugal, a lot of the Latin-based cultures, and then of course Switzerland is considered that. How important is the family? So take a look at Eastern Europe, family collectivism. Eastern Europe countries, Greece, Kazakhstan, Poland, Russia, all those, that's almost 6. It's the same as the Arab cultures, where family is extremely important. So you're going to want to take, you take in the bottom line of this is, as you look at the way Globe broke these down, it gives you some information of being able to understand how cultures react to different situations and looking to see if your company can actually fit in. Yeah, so we kind of take a look at some different culture aspects here in this particular slide. I was just kind of throwing a few things together, which would be different and looking at things. So in Japan, etiquette is super important in Japan. It's also about the group and the benefit of the group. Social rank is important. So you can't send a lower level negotiator to Japan. You need to make sure that person has that decision-making authority and can make decisions, because Japan's not looking to have to go back and rally around you. That person needs to be able to have the authority to make decisions when you send somebody to Japan. Also, you can't really cold call in Japan. You must have some access, some key, maybe a key contact that can make you an introduction. If you don't make the introduction, not like the US where you might be able to talk your way into it. Japan's not that way. As a society, you need to know somebody. And then honor is key. And you kind of see this as we go through here. It's a fairly, honor is definitely plays out in a lot of these cultures. Korea, big difference there is you've got the elders there play a big important role. Less in Japan, but in Korea, definitely the elders still play a control. Arab countries, considered left hand is considered to be, unclean. So you wouldn't shake hands, even if you're left-handed, with your left hand. It would be considered to be an insult. In the Arab countries, you don't, in a small talk in the US, you might be asking about how your family is. Definitely not acceptable in Arab cultures. And if they accept a woman into a meeting in some of these highly Arab cultures, they're going to want to be moderately dressed. So again, it's that aspect of how you view, the culture is viewing women. It's not, and you have to accept that if you're going to do business there. And then the time here in Latin America, time is a rough construct. So if they're 15 minutes late, as opposed to if you're 15 minutes late in Japan, you're not going to get seen. If you're 15 minutes late in Latin America, or they're 15 minutes late, it's not such a big deal. They can live with that. So again, that's a different way of looking at things. Okay. And you really kind of have to look at now how you manage and market those aspects. And then here's just a few points of kind of bringing everything back together. You really got to consider advertising and how it can be tailored to the culture there. How culture communicates. All of these things affect whether you're going to be able to market your product there or do business there. So that's why culture is extremely an important factor there. Okay, so now we're going to kind of move into political and legal structures, which is more chapter 6. So what we've got here is first part of it, and when we look at types of governments or political systems, the first one is we've got, a true democracy, which is ruled by the people. True democracies are kind of tough to, which means everybody has a vote, which is a tough one to do these days. So you would have to vote on everything. Now, we do have some of this a little bit when you take a look at some of the states that have a little bit more of a pure democracy type of rule in areas where they kind of vote on most major issues, or they have a caucus. That's kind of where that's still part of the old tried and true full democracy, where every citizen has a vote. But these days, it's kind of not practical, especially for large democracies. So in the Athenian part of that is the Athenian type of democracy is the purest form of democracy where everybody votes on everything. Again, not much on the Athenians being able to handle this on a larger scale. Just kind of hinders the way things are. Most places, excuse me, most places have a representative democracy similar to what we have, where we elect individuals to go ahead and represent us for a certain period of time, and that's and we give them that authority to be able to move forward and help us move forward. But you're not voting on every single law. So that's, we have that representative style of topic there. So then we look at this aspect of totalitarianism or totalitarian governments, which is where it has the citizens do not have any say into what happens. So for instance, a military dictatorship such as in Venezuela, or in some of the African countries, or you have a religious aspect of totalitarianism government in what we see in Afghanistan going into effect, or Iran, or Iraq. Those are, and as a matter of fact, even in Saudi Arabia, because that's a kingdom. So where the citizens don't really have, they're governed without any aspect or input from the citizens. So that's where you get that's a totalitarian government political system. So most countries are in one or two of these different kinds, and and it comes in different forms, but these are kind of the basic forms that you're going to have. Okay, so then you've got these aspects of what we call economic ideologies, which is the way a country chooses to tend to do business. So we have communism, socialism, and capitalism. Okay. So capitalism is what we know, which is businesses are privately owned. There's strong individual incentives, and government plays very little role in the economy. That's kind of what we were founded on in this country. And then we've kind of evolved into something else a little bit, somewhere between capitalism and socialism. That's why when you hear people talk about we're leaning socialism, well, this is where government plays a strong role in the economy and may own stakes in certain businesses. So as the government moves along, we're kind of in that situation where we kind of are fitting somewhere in between these two at the moment. Government plays a huge role in our economy, thus the stimulus packages, thus the aspect of owning stakes in certain businesses, which they do. For instance, in Florida, the state owns its own hurricane insurance fund, as an example of government actually owning in a certain business. They outright own that. Social Security is technically kind of an annuity fund where it's running a business there. The post office is a business that's owned wholly by the U.S. government. So, and funded by the US government. And a lot of people really want to push that towards being more capitalistic and move that towards a private setting. So sometimes we kind of center in the US somewhere between this, as does Europe and a lot of the first world countries right now, kind of straddles somewhere between socialism and capitalism. And that's why you hear people saying we're becoming more socialist, depending on your viewpoint. Communism is where the government or the state controls all major factors of everything. So right now, you're really getting, and right now there's actually capitalism inside communism as well. For instance, China is definitely a communist society. But they're becoming a little bit more capitalistic because communism has been proven that it's not sustainable in that sense. Same in Russia, it's not, that is still a communist country. However, they are also looking at capitalism and have capitalism in there. So probably the only true communist nation still left on right now, 100% communist, it's going to be North Korea. Everybody else is adopting this kind of merge between capitalism and communism, where the government owns everything. I often use the example of Google. When Google first went into China, that they thought they could do what Google does, and found out very quickly. The government kind of clamped down on them very quickly because the government in China is not about the free flow of information. So when they went back into China, they went in with a Chinese-owned company to be able to bridge that gap between doing business in there and what's acceptable to the communist government inside China. So those again are national ideological structures, and there's kind of some blurring in between those. Okay, so you have economic risks when you're doing business abroad, and economic risks problems or mismanagement in a country could have a huge impact on your business and your impact to do business in that country. Some of the things that you might run into are going to be a lot of currencies in the world are volatile, and the bottom can drop out of them. So if that bottom drops out of a currency that you're doing business with, you could lose a ton of money really quickly. You can conversely, the currency could go up and you could make a whole lot of money. Just depends on how well that currency is doing against the dollar on any given day. But there could be a way, but that government could at any point put restrictions on or add tariffs to money going out of the country. Things about a possibility of the inability to repay loans. Human resources and labor relations problems are different in those countries, and inflation and corruption are always there. You can mitigate those, but you gotta have your eyes open to make sure that you know what's going on. So political risk is the political forces of something going wrong in that country, a coup happening. Okay. Those are big things. That's the biggest one probably is that political forces decide they're going to overthrow the current government. So we divide that kind of into two different risks: macro, obviously the global, the bigger picture, and micro in the smaller picture. So political risk essentially that affects all businesses in a given country. So a coup would definitely affect all businesses in a particular country. Whereas a micro political one would be, it could be a certain set of companies or an industry, certain industry in a particular country where, the government takes over and all of a sudden decides they're not going to want any external banana plantations, for instance. Then that really only affects banana plantations. Okay. So that's going to be just a risk that would occur only in a particular subset of the company. So we have a couple of things where terrorism and political risk go hand in hand. Obviously, I'm doing this on the anniversary of this particular video is being recorded on the anniversary of 9/11. And right about this time, I remember very specifically what happened on 9/11 in 2000. So when you're looking at this in 2001, so when you're looking at this, you know, and basically the government came up with in 2002 with the Terrorism Risk Assurance Act. So the U.S. law allows it's a tax deduction basically for businesses against or insurance coverage against the risk of terrorism. And then the U.S. government actually got into the business of selling political risk insurance, but it was but they only do that in countries where we have where there's a back and forth between them, that you can actually use our company to be our country's insurance policy organization. The Overseas Private Investment goes back to what we talked about before. Government. This is a government-run institution, so so it's a U.S. guy. So we can talk about government owning an industry, and that's a good example, one right there. But you can actually buy business insurance. Okay. These are in 2013, but to be honest with you, they haven't really changed much. Obviously, some of them may have shifted around a little bit now. And some of these in the top 10, not places you don't want to go as a business, probably haven't changed drastically, other than there might be some shifting between them. Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, the Sudan, Haiti, Zimbabwe, Honduras, and Nigeria. A couple African countries, a couple of islands, one in South America, Central America, one in one island here on this side, but most of these are all overseas. Afghanistan might have moved to the top now. Iraq might be moved to the top. It really doesn't matter. These are all still aspects of those. You know, those are all definitely aspects of where you would. You know, these are countries you want to avoid, basically, plain and simple. And it hasn't really changed much since 2013. Corruption. Okay. Corruption is one of those things which is illegal in the United States. It's also illegal to do this abroad if you're a U.S. company. Okay. But what that corruption is the situation where businesses are illegally alter the relevant decision-making power by some external factor. Typically, right now, when they talk about the latter part, is the blackmail extortion. Much fewer cases of U.S. companies doing that type of activity, but bribes and kickbacks, probably we're not above doing that. The latter two, you definitely would find in other countries. You can actually take a look at some of the South American countries, and there's plenty of YouTube videos and those types of things of what happens down there if you don't do what they want in the way they want it. So private corruption is involving basically private corruption is business to business or individuals, but it's basically business to business. Whereas public is business to some public official that would be you know, paying off an inspector to look the other way, as JBL used to do in Brazil. You know, it's one of those where they were able to, the meatpacking industry in Brazil was easily swayed with the right amount of blackmail. So not to say blackmail, the good amount of bribes. So you can, you know, to look the other way or to expedite something. Eastern European countries work this way as well. If you want something moved, you know, then you've got to, so they call it grease the right palms. But again, all of this is highly illegal for a US company to do this. So when you're looking at going abroad, you need to kind of look at these three aspects of law and the legal environment of where you're moving into, okay? We'll start on the left-hand side here with civil law. Basically, it's understanding the list, basically of the legal rules that are actually set in law. So typically, most societies have civil and criminal law. Now, criminal is violations against a lawful society, where civil law is those aspects of what happens with individuals within the society. You know, criminal cases, easily you justify those. That's, you know, things like burglary, murder, and the like, okay? Whereas civil law is about things like listing of legal rules, how you do things as a business, who gets what, how you can handle your business. Common law. So basically, this is law that comes from courts. So, and we see that in the US all the time. They talk about the courts making law. Well, in essence, they do, because they create precedents. So what they do is kind of interpret those civil laws when they don't seem to be as clear as they should be. Then the courts go ahead and say, hey, we're gonna set forth these particular things, and they become what they call more of a legal precedent. But what they will, but then they in essence become common law. Everybody still has to abide by that opinion of the court till they change their mind. And then theocratic law, not so much a big issue in the US, but if you go to Afghanistan right now, or Iran, or Iraq, all of those areas are based on theocratic law. If you go to Israel, theocratic law also plays effect in it with a different religion. You know, obviously Islam in those areas of Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan are all, those are all Islamic controlled states. So you really want to be, you know, you have to really take into account what those laws are, which may not make sense by our Western cultures. Even some of the things that Israel does not always make sense, but it's based on their religious teachings. And then the last thing we're going to talk about here is these are different aspects of laws that, as you start to look abroad, and they're vastly different in countries that they're at. You have obviously criminal. We kind of touched on that a little bit earlier here. What's considered a crime against society there. Contract law. If you're doing contracts in a particular country, you want to know how those contracts can be enforced. So it's important to really understand that country's aspect of how to enforce a contract. What are their tax laws like? Before you decide to go into a country or operate in a country, you need to know how their tax system is structured. How antitrust is viewed, so how you conduct your company and how your competition can operate. So those are things like collusion and those types of things. So can you really handle those types of things? Product safety law. Okay, how does the implications of how safe your product is, and how does the government view that in that society? And then the dispute settlement law. So if you have a dispute with somebody else or with an employee, how does that handle? Do you have to sue? Do they have to sue? Or is it an automatic arbitration situation where it's just one person deciding those factors? All of these they do play an important role into those types of things. All right, so these here kind of wrap up this aspect of these two chapters, and I'll be talking to you soon in reference to our next two.